and welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports Network. That's Beanie Wells. That's Tom Fornelli. I'm Chip Patterson. Very excited to get you set for the weekend ahead, for the weekends ahead, with a very special spring practice look ahead. We are going to be going around the country. We are going from the Big Ten to the SEC to the ACC to the Big 12. The three of us are going to give you burning questions for all of these conferences. But first, gentlemen, we have to begin with a wild story at the University of Tennessee, because we are constantly faced with reminders that the college football world is changing before our eyes, and look no further than the current situation around Tennessee star quarterback Nico Iamaleava, because according to reports, he was not at practice here on Friday. Tennessee has its spring game coming up on Saturday. According to reports, there is a bit of a back and forth going on right now between Nico's camp and Tennessee regarding his current NIL contract. Now, Nico was kind of the face of NIL. We remember that big deal, some NCAA issues, which were later dismissed. And so I want to dig into this a little bit. And so got to start with our former Ohio State star running back, Beanie. You have, been up to date and sort of seen how the player experience has changed. What is your takeaway from hearing about, NIL negotiations at the end of spring practice right before the transfer portal opens? What do we make of this Nico Iamaleava situation?
It's so wild that we're in this state right now in college football where guys can essentially, hold out, so to speak, for contract negotiations. Yep. And this is a situation right now that we're looking at with Nico. We know how sensational season he had his freshman year, but now it seems to be one of those deals where he's understanding he has the leverage right now with this football team. So why not go ahead and try to secure more dollars? Crazy mindset, crazy thought. Never thought we'd be here in college football, but this is the state in which we stand right now. And, if I'm Tennessee, I do whatever I can to get my young quarterback under contract, which is crazy as heck. We're talking about college football, but under contract so I can get him in spring ball. I can get him acclimated to what we want to do, because we want to build around a young quarterback that's a stud like Nico.
Yeah, I feel like as a fan, if you're a Tennessee fan or a fan of any school, this is kind of terrifying in that you understand that in this modern era, players on your team will enter the transfer portal. Some guys will leave, some new guys will come in. But to be in this situation where you're going into spring practice and your starting quarterback is doing a holdout, and now it's possible because the portal will open again in a couple of weeks here. You're sitting there terrified that your starting quarterback's going to leave for another school at some point and kind of leave you in the lurch and kind of throw your season, upside down. But as a human being, not a fan, just a rational person, this is a brilliant move if you are Nico Iamaleava, because if you think about it, he probably has an offer. Not that any other school would ever dare tamper with a player currently on the roster somewhere else, but he probably has an offer to another school, which he's using as leverage to get a better deal at Tennessee. But also, this is something that is along the lines of what we see in the NFL, where players will hold out of training camp and they will, try to get a new deal. But in the NFL, because everything has been collectively bargained, if you hold out of training camp, you get fined. At the college level, Nico is not going to lose a dime. He literally has nothing to lose at this point. He could sit out practice all he wants. Tennessee's in a situation where it's either we pay him or we lose him. So it's not like he's losing money. So from a business standpoint, it's a pretty smart move by Nico's part, because if he did hit the portal, I guarantee you, even after coming off of a somewhat down season, although the Vols did make the college football playoff, he would get paid.
Right. That's the thing here, is that individually, the performance from Nico last season, wasn't the kind of thing that had you thinking that, he was going to be the face of that campaign. That was a run-heavy team. They ran the ball extremely effectively. They played a great, nasty defensive line. But, Tom, he's still the starting quarterback for a college football playoff team. That is going to give you a little bit of cachet. The quarterback depth, as we showed on the screen earlier, gives him a little bit of that leverage that Beanie mentioned earlier. Before we move on, and we are going to get to spring games, and I do want to mention CBS Sports and 24/7 Sports have been on top of this. This is not necessarily a situation where anything is clear. There are some around Nico's family that say there are no negotiations, everything is fine. There are reports coming from the Tennessee camp that are a little bit concerned that all of this came out to light. Beanie, you are involved in coaching. You've got your own sons that are coming up too. What, as a father and as somebody who could be in this position maybe one day, what does this experience sort of say about the future of college athletes in this current NIL era?
It is so wild. It certainly says that at some point in time, I don't know who steps in, whether it's the conferences, whether it's the NCAA, but they better get a hold on it, because this is not something that you want to set precedent in college football, because we understand there's going to be so many great players year after year that have these quote unquote freshman sensation seasons. And now you don't want to be in a position as a football team to where you're kind of held up and you're stuck up, as we go through the offseason, just for a guy to go and get more money. Now, obviously, we know what's going to happen in terms of guys getting more NIL dollars, but you don't want to be in a situation to where you're counting on a player to be there and he's not going to be there because you're not offering this exact dollar amount that he wants. This is a crazy landscape. I can't imagine that the NCAA institutions are going to want to allow this thing to kind of get out of hand. I think the NIL has been in play for a couple of years now. It's time they start to reel it in and set some clear, constructive parameters around this thing so we don't get this thing being any more of the Wild Wild West in which we've already seen.
Yeah, things are crazy now. Like, it all exists, but you are free to do as you want. There are a lot of people there's no kind of red tape that anybody has to cut through. You can kind of just do whatever you want at this point. Like, it's ironic we have gone from college athletes having the most restrictive situation possible of athletes in the country to now college athletes have more freedom than even professional athletes who are actually bound by their contracts to stick to what they're doing. So I do think it is only a matter of time until the college model becomes more of an employer-employee model. How long that's going to take and what we're going to have to do to get there, I'm not sure. But I just feel like the more cases like this that we see where what's happening, the more likely and the quicker this is going to get done. So maybe in a way, Nico's kind of, he's leading a revolution here. We might see an employee-employer model pretty quickly.
Yeah, Nico, the face of the revolution. I don't know if I projected that when he was a five-star prospect coming out of high school. All right, so Tennessee spring game is on Saturday. Naturally, a lot of eyes will be there. But a lot of eyes are also going to be up in Columbus, where the reigning national champions are going to be taking the field. And Tom, I'm going to let you get first stab at this. You had a story on CBSSports.com here today pointing out that while everyone is used to a lot of attention on the Ohio State spring game, they are one of the most well-attended spring games every single year. It is always a big festivity. And now we've got Ryan Day, who came out after initially saying it wasn't going to be much of a spring game. He saw all those young players who still need to get out there and get hit. He said, oh yeah, we'll have a couple series of thud, and then we're going to go out and tackle to the ground. Now, you talked about the makeup of the team, what you're looking ahead in Ohio State spring game. So I'll let you get first crack at this. What is standing out to you when you think about the Buckeyes and what we might see this weekend?
Hey, you mentioned the amount of fans that usually attend this game. I hope they have programs to buy so they know who the players on the field are, because that Ohio State roster we saw winning a national title and all that confetti a few months ago looks a lot different right now. A lot of key guys have gone, and obviously the biggest attention is going to be spent at the quarterback position, as is often the case in the spring. There is the open quarterback battle between Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kienholz, and Tavian St. Clair. Ryan Day, to this point, is saying that it's neck and neck. I don't know if I fully buy that because, as I said, actions will speak louder than words. Lincoln Kienholz was on the roster when you went into the transfer portal and got Julian Sayin out of it, so you spent quite a bit of money to get him to Columbus. I have a feeling Sayin is in charge, or at least he is the prospective leader. But as we just talked about with Nico, with the way the transfer portal says, you kind of have to keep everybody happy for as long as possible. So Ryan Day will say that it is neck and neck for as long as he possibly can.
Yeah, one thing I don't want to see is this thing to be neck and neck for too long, because remember how the situation went previous to last season, when we had a couple of quarterbacks and this thing went all the way into the season when they were, trying to figure out who was going to be the guy. And that didn't fare well for this football team. So that's one of the things that you want to see Ryan Day, make a decision a lot sooner. Hopefully we're getting a decision just before training camp or maybe the second week of training camp. But this is one of those deals where you look at Lincoln and you look at Julian Sayin, you say one of those guys has to separate themselves. And not to say that, Tavian St. Clair has been chopped liver. I just don't believe in the state of college football right now. If you're a team coming off a national championship, if you want to go out and try to repeat with a young freshman quarterback, I think right now the model's changing. Guys want quarterbacks with experience, and I don't think Ohio State is no different. But just not the quarterback position. We got to look at the running backs. we lost two premier running backs in Quinshawn Judkins and Travion Henderson. So replacing those guys is going to be no easy task. The Buckeyes definitely have their work cut out for them. That's why I believe this is one of the more important springs in Columbus in years.
You also had, Beanie, the loss of Jim Knowles to Penn State. We'll be talking about the Nittany Lions here in just a little bit. New offensive coordinator as well. What do you think the coaching staff changes mean for Ohio State as they try to develop new players, but also work in some new coaches?
It's going to be critical. Obviously, we all loved what we saw of Jim Knowles last season, particularly in the back end of the season. When he first came there, he played that bend but don't break style of defense. And, fans were pulling their hair out because we were giving up too many big plays. But it finally settled in, and his team started to buy into his philosophy. And so when you lose a guy like that after winning a national championship, after playing sensational defense down the stretch, it's hard. Because now what's going to be your identity on the defensive side of the football? Obviously, you want to rush the passer always, but we lose two of our top pass rushers and another guy in the interior defensive line that was so critical. So not just replacing Jim Knowles and his philosophy, but replacing the guys that fit so well in his system is going to be critical for Buckeyes.
Yeah, and you look at Matt Patricia, who is stepping into Knowles' place as the defensive coordinator. Like, this is his first time coaching at the college. Might be extremely talented, but don't have that kind of experience that maybe, you need to teach them a bit more about what they need to be doing. And also, will Matt Patricia kind of want to put his own stamp on the defense? Like, Jim Knowles was very successful running his defense the way he wanted to run it. Now he's off to Penn State. Does Patricia look at the example of what they were doing last year and maybe tinker with it? Or is he trying to bring in his entire new system, which could lead to some more problems considering the lack of experience they have on that side of the ball right now?
No fan from another school wants to hear this, and they want to say first world problems because Ohio State recruits 4 and 5 stars at every single position. Those guys still got to go learn what to do. They still have to go out there and execute, and that's what spring practice is all about. That's what some of the stuff we'll be looking forward to keeping an eye on. The new faces taking the field in a familiar place, the reigning champion Ohio State Buckeyes. You can watch their spring game this weekend on Big Ten Network. Well, from Ohio State to the Big Ten at large, coming up on the other side, our Burning Questions series begins in the Big Ten Conference with a look at Michigan, Penn State, and Oregon, just a couple other Big Ten title contenders, and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Beanie Wells, Tom Fornelli, I'm Chip Patterson, as we take a look at some of the spring practice storylines across the country, and we have some burning questions. So, Beanie, we're looking at the whole Big Ten. We did get to dig into Ohio State a little bit earlier in the hour. What non-Ohio State topics stand out to you? What's your burning question in the Big Ten?
The burning question I have, should Penn State be the favorite to win the Big Ten championship, but also a favorite to win the national championship? We know they were one of the teams last year in the college football playoff. They added Jim Knowles. They played well down the stretch, has a ton of talent coming back. Drew Aller leading that charge, Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton. I think Penn State is going to be a team to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I think if you look at the blueprint of the teams that have won the last 2 national titles, Michigan and Ohio State, Michigan 2 years ago retained a lot of its talent. Last year, Ohio State retained a lot of their talent that could have gone to the NFL draft. This Penn State team has retained a lot of the talent that they had on last year's team. Abdul Carter is gone, but there are mostly, like you mentioned, Singleton is back, Katron Allen is back. You have Drew Aller, who is in a season in which we're entering with a lot of question marks at the quarterback in the Big Ten and across the country. Drew Aller is one of the more known commodities. The question is, we have seen him in big games not play as well as we have seen him in the games where Penn State is, favored to win by large scores. So can he take his game to that next level? Because we know with Jim Knowles coming in, like Penn State's defense every single season is always great. So with Jim Knowles coming in to take over that, we could probably be pretty confident that that defense will still be one of the better defenses in the country. Can Drew take that offense to another level now that Tyler Warren and a couple of other guys have left? If he does, this is very much a Penn State team that I think, yes, should be the favorite in the Big Ten and could be a national title contender, but it's all on Aller's shoulders.
It's amazing. This is the most amount of true preseason title hype that I can think of in the James Franklin era. This team was a Drew Aller whoopsie daisy and a field goal away from playing for the national championship. I mean, they were that close from at least getting another crack at Ohio State. And then, it ends up being Notre Dame in that spot. Drew Aller, can he get it? Can he get the pass catchers around him to raise their level as well? Tom, what's the burning question on your end when it comes to the Big Ten?
Can Bryce Underwood win the job at Michigan? He is the 5-star phenom incoming quarterback, one of the top players in the class. Everybody understands how great he is. Our Cover 3 co-host, Bud Elliott, has told us that he's not making the direct comparison, but he's saying that he has not seen another high school remind him of Cam Newton as much as Bryce Underwood reminds him of Cam Newton at that similar stage in their lives. So that's a lot of pressure to put on. And you add to the fact that Michigan last year, very disappointing overall, coming off of a national title season. Now, season ended well for them. I'm sorry, Beanie, but they did have that win over Ohio State. They did pick up the win over Alabama in the bowl game, but overall, a very down year. Now you're heading into the second year under Sharon Moore with Underwood coming in, but they also brought in the veteran option in Mikey Keene from Fresno State. And I'm thinking the most likely outcome here is the same that we saw with Michigan a few years ago when J.J. McCarthy was a freshman. Cade McNamara will start the season as a starter, and they worked McCarthy in. I think you're going to see a lot of that same stuff where Keene will be the starter to begin the year, but they're going to try to work Underwood in and give him as much of a chance as possible to win that job because he just raises the ceiling of what that team can be.
Look, I don't think any coach in the country last year has done more with less than Sharon Moore. For them to be in a position that they were to beat Ohio State, win some big games on the road and be very competitive while not having really good quarterback. Well, just space it. Terrible quarterback play last year.
Yes.
I thought they did a really great job. And, for Bryce Underwood to get a talent like him, and if he's able to come in and take the reins and, get the tutelage under Sharon Moore and lead the charge, it'd be incredible. But we can't forget about who you just mentioned, Mikey Keene, and what he did the past 2 years at Fresno State. Over 70% completion percentage, 18 touchdowns last year, had 11 picks, does have an issue taking care of the football. But in terms of being efficient in under pressure situations, Mikey Keene's a very good quarterback. So it'll be a tall task, in my opinion, for Sharon Moore to hand the reins over to a freshman quarterback. But nonetheless, you're paying a guy $8 million. That may have something to do with it as well, but I don't think Mikey Keene's going to lay down either.
Yeah, much love to Davis Warren, but our own Tom Fornelli pointed out he's probably more of a Central Michigan or an Eastern Michigan quarterback, not necessarily the University of Michigan, but yet he was still able to get those wins against Ohio State, wins against Alabama, getting it done for Big Blue. I'm going to keep it with the quarterbacks, y'all, because Dylan Gabriel was that sort of veteran presence that made the transition from Bo Nix to Dylan Gabriel make sense. And while Dante Moore is not a rookie, he even has starting experience from when he was a freshman at UCLA. Is Dante Moore a championship caliber quarterback? Because Dante Moore has all the tools in the world, and he obviously has that first-round projection coming out of high school. But what we saw when he was thrown into the fire with Chip Kelly as a freshman with the Bruins was very, very raw. And for Oregon, if this is going to be a season where you're going to try to bounce back from the utter disappointment that was that Rose Bowl performance in the wake of winning the Big Ten in year one, I think Dante Moore is going to have to do a lot. Dante Moore is going to have to be a little bit more than just Will Stein's joystick. So if Dante Moore in this time has been able to develop into the kind of quarterback where we look at him as maybe one of the 3-4 best quarterbacks in the Big Ten, we could be talking about a team that can defend or win again or contend again for the Big Ten. If Dante Moore is, a B-plus kind of quarterback, then I think the Ducks might be looking at that 4th, 5th type spot in the Big Ten. So my burning question for Oregon, it really has to do with whether Dante Moore is really good or whether he's something special.
Yeah, I think if you look at this, if you look at the situation overall, I think Oregon's in a very interesting spot simply because they won the Big Ten last year, which is incredible to come into a league and win it in your first year. But you look at how Dan Lanning has done things with this programs. They have, this is the first real time we are going to see the results of the recruiting classes they have put together, because the entire time that Lanning has been there, his quarterbacks have been Bo Nix, who transferred in with plenty of experience, and who was then Dylan Gabriel, who had even more experience. And then you look on the defensive side of the ball, a lot of the stars on that side of the ball were also transfers. So this is the first time we're really going to see an Oregon roster mostly comprised of those high 4 and 5 stars that Dan Lanning's been recruiting and they have been developing the last few years, who have been watching these transfers kind of lead the Ducks to the top of the Big Ten. So Moore is a transfer in from UCLA, but he does not have a lot of experience. He only played in 7 games as a freshman before entering the portal. I think there are a lot of questions about this Ducks team, more than I had going into last year, where I wasn't, I had them as one of the favorites to win the league. If they're able to pull that off again, I think we could start wondering if Dan Lanning has built an absolute juggernaut in Eugene.
Tom, I'm with you. I think it's going to be more about what Dante Moore has around him. And right now, we just don't know that. They lose a lot. Now, obviously, you got guys graduating seniors, but the fact that they were able to hit the transfer portal and be so successful is great. But you can't keep those guys for long in the transfer portal, because a lot of times they're juniors and seniors and trying to get to the next level. And I think with Dante Moore, with him being a quarterback that doesn't have a lot of experience, how's he going to fare with a young freshman wide receiver out there? Is he going to be able to get him lined up right? Is he going to be able to have that specific timing? Like you said, we saw him at UCLA. He was very raw, and he was in a situation then at UCLA with Chip Kelly where he didn't have an abundance of talent around him. Now, Dan Lanning does recruit really well, and he does have an offensive philosophy that, in my opinion, is second to none in college football. But how is he going to do with younger guys around him? I think that's the biggest question mark there.
Great call, Beanie. I mean, Tez Johnson, senior, Trayshawn Holden, senior, Terrence Ferguson, senior. I mean, these are older players that you had at the pass catching positions with the dominant share of the receptions and the yards for the Ducks. A lot of turnover there in Eugene. Well, coming up on the other side, we turn our attention to the SEC with some burning questions for the Georgia Bulldogs, Alabama Crimson Tide, and the Texas Longhorns, and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Beanie Wells, Tom Fornelli, I'm Chip Patterson. We are getting you set for the big weekends ahead. This weekend, next weekend, the following one. A lot of spring games, spring practice wrapping up. These are our burning questions. We turn our attention to the SEC, where, Tom, you are looking at the reigning Southeastern Conference champions. What's the burning question you have for the Georgia Bulldogs?
Yeah, it is kind of strange that Georgia's season last year felt like a disappointment and they still won the SEC anyway. It's just that speaks to the level that Kirby Smart has built that program. But I'm just wondering, what kind of drop-off, if any, are we going to see with Georgia having to go from Carson Beck to Gunnar Stockton? Because Carson Beck last year, in my opinion, was not nearly the same quarterback we saw in 2023. He really seemed to struggle with the drop-off going from Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey to the receivers that the Bulldogs had last year. And it impacted his stats, and it impacted Georgia overall. And we saw a little bit of Stockton in the playoff getting that start after Carson Beck was injured in the SEC championship game. The kid has a cannon. Like, you see him throw the ball and you see the velocity. It's like, even when you're watching on TV, I feel like you can hear that ball zipping through the air. But now that the offense is his and he is in charge, will he be able to refine that arm, or will they be able to, develop him a bit more to have him make the throws that maybe aren't the home runs? Can he start hitting the singles and the doubles and moving runners over? And however any other baseball cliches I can split into this one. I just think that this is an interesting situation because Georgia, we know, again, they lose a lot of monsters on defense. They're still going to be good defensively. They lose a lot of guys on the interior of their offensive line. To me, that is a significant concern, but the way that they have recruited and developed, I have confidence that their offensive line will still be pretty good. The question will be, can Gunnar be the kind of guy who can once again get them to the top of the SEC and not only get them to the playoff, but can they actually win a game this time? Because that's the one thing that they didn't do last year.
This is an interesting situation. When you look at the fact that, when you look at Georgia as a whole on the offensive end, they were down. They were not a very good football team. And I think a lot of us anticipated them with Carson Beck at the helm being one of the best offenses in the country. And they just weren't that for whatever reason. Now you switch quarterbacks. Now you don't have the same running game, which last year even though they had Etienne, I don't feel like their run game was as impressive as a traditional Georgia football team anyways. But with Gunnar Stockton, can he revamp this offense? You mentioned last year we saw that zip on his passes, and he looked to be a competent quarterback. But the numbers necessarily didn't reflect, in the production on the offensive end didn't reflect. Now they're going to have different pieces around him. They get a Zachariah Branch, who I thought was one of the best playmakers on a bad team last year from USC transferring over. And then they get Noah Thompson as well from A&M. So hopefully, for Georgia's sake, he is a quarterback that has all the intangibles. He just needs players around him to where they can figure out how to, best put pieces in place for this offense to be successful. Because last year was not it. And I can't see Georgia winning another SEC championship with the same caliber of offense as last season.
Yeah, Georgia football is good when you can run the daggone ball, right? Mm-hmm. And they've got offensive line pieces they've got to replace as well. It's a lot to look at there with Georgia, but it is Georgia, so we're always going to expect that Kirby Smart can figure out a way to do it with all the talented ingredients he's got to make that stew. All right, speaking of talent, we are losing Jalen Milroe at Alabama. Kalen DeBoer under a little bit of pressure. Beanie, what's your burning question for the Alabama Crimson Tide?
Will Kalen DeBoer and the Crimson Tide have a bounce back year? Last year they were 9-4. The first time in 16 years, sounds so crazy, that they did not hit double-digit victories. And that was obviously due in part to one of the greatest coaches ever in college football, and Nick Saban. But what can they do without the quarterback in Jalen Milroe, where he, in my opinion, disguised a lot of inefficiencies that they had on that offensive football team? And most certainly, we did not see the same caliber Alabama-style defense in which we've become accustomed to seeing over the years. So my burning question is, will they bounce back and get it done on both sides of the ball?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like, when they don't have the hit the Jalen Milroe run for a first down button or just break a big play, how that offense is going to look. But I do have, like, considering the Kalen DeBoer's history going back to, Fresno State and then at Washington, there is a certain level of competence I do expect Alabama to have on the offensive side of the football, particularly now that Ryan Grubb is coming in as offensive coordinator. So those two are reuniting. The bigger question to me is who will be the guy running that offense? Will it be Ty Simpson? Will it be Austin Mack? The word coming out of Tuscaloosa right now seems to be that Ty Simpson is in the lead in that competition, which to me is a concern. And I have seen Ty Simpson play. Now, obviously, he has never been the starter, but the limited snaps I have seen him playing at Alabama, I just don't know if he is good enough to get Alabama to where it wants to be. And I'm not trying to knock the kid. I think he's a good QB, but if they want to win the SEC, you look at the quarterbacks around that league going into 2025, you need a good quarterback, somebody who can lead you in some games where maybe, the rest of the team is not playing great. And I think Alabama, as you mentioned, Beanie, like just the level of expectations that this program has based on their history of success, coming off of a season in which they missed out on the college football playoff. Whoever ends up winning that starting QB job, that is a lot of pressure immediately put on their shoulders because you're supposed to compete for an SEC title and you're supposed to get to the playoff as a minimum. If there are a couple losses early in the season or struggles, how do things start going? It is one of the more interesting situations to watch this spring and heading into the fall.
Yeah, I feel so sorry for this man because we continually call it out when we talk about this topic, but like you can't win the SEC in 2025 with 2015 Jake Coker. Jake Coker got Alabama all the way to the national championship, but the level of quarterback in this league has changed. The level of quarterback across the country at the top of the sport has changed, and the offenses and the defenses, it's just not going to be something where, Oh, yeah, and he had a guy named Derrick Henry. I don't know if you guys remember that guy, but, kind of helps a quarterback when you got Derrick Henry out back there. This is going to be a fascinating job. Alabama, they also have their spring game coming up this weekend. No television for it, but obviously plenty of coverage over at 24/7 Sports. I'm going to turn our attention to a team that does not have a spring game. No, after a deep college football playoff run, Texas coach Steve Sarkisian said, you know what, we're going to use all 15 of these for just straight up practice, just make sure development. And there's no quarterback questions because Arch Manning, his era, his time has finally arrived. My burning question, Who's going to catch all these passes? Now, I've got some ideas because we saw Ryan Wingo as a freshman have a flash a little bit. We saw DeAndre Moore, 7 touchdown receptions as a sophomore. But when you think about losing Matthew Golden, losing Isaiah Bonds, there's a lot of players that are going to be gone. Steve Sarkisian has used the transfer portal each of the last 2 cycles to replenish the skill positions. No wide receivers taken in the winter portal. This is Steve Sarkisian relying on the recruiting and the development of a lot of young players. And so my burning question is going to be, all right, we know about Arch, but Arch can't get it done on his own. What do the pieces look like around Arch Manning? All right, coming up on the go ahead.
No, go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say, one thing you can rely on, though, like if you look at the quarterback situation with Arch, we don't know who the receivers are, but one thing Sarkisian can lean on is the fact that this year with Arch, he will have a far more mobile quarterback than he had with Quinn Ewers. So maybe we won't need to see that kind of caliber receiver. So maybe not the same as the Jalen Milroe button we were discussing earlier in the segment, but I think Arch just gives you so much more with his legs than Quinn Ewers was able to give you last year, particularly the banged up version of Ewers we saw most of the season.
Yeah, I'm excited, obviously, to see Arch at the helm, as just about everybody in the country. But, like we're talking about right now, who's he going to be throwing to on a consistent basis? Ryan Wingo showed flashes last year of being a very good receiver, obviously being young, and so did Moore. But it's going to take a lot more weapons than just those 2 guys for us to see Arch at his full potential, and Texas being one of those high-caliber teams in the country.
100%. Well, coming up on the other side, we turn our attention to the Atlantic Coast Conference, where a Super Bowl winning coach takes over at a program that's looking to take a step forward. Clemson tries to maintain its hold atop the conference, and the first ever 17th place team in ACC football history looks for a bounce back. What's ahead for the Florida State Seminoles and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, taking a look at some burning questions from all across spring practice. We turn our attention to the ACC. So, Beanie, I got to ask you, it felt like, just a comfortable coat, right? Clemson's back on top. It was a little stressful. They needed a long field goal as time expired to get there. But the Clemson Tigers, as ACC champions back in the college football playoff, it felt like something I'm used to. What's your burning question about Dabo Swinney's Tigers heading into 2025?
If they're going to be a legitimate contender. Last year, yes, they got back in the college football playoff, but I felt like they kind of backdoored themselves into this thing, and they had some things go their way that allowed them to be in position to be playing in the college football playoff. And Cade Klubnik, is he going to be the quarterback that we think he can be? And I think over the last couple of seasons, we've all seen flashes of Cade and said he looks like he can be one of the top quarterbacks in the country, but he just hasn't been consistent. Is he going to be consistent enough to have his team in position to be consistently talked about throughout the season as one of the top teams in college football?
Yeah, you mentioned Klubnik. It's like so much of this show, we've been talking about these burning questions for all these programs going into the spring. And the topic we've talked about the most is the quarterback position. Clemson is one of the few teams in the country where I don't have many questions about their quarterback. Cade Klubnik has one of the more experience than just about any of the returning starters coming back in the year. And I've been on the record the last few years as being somewhat of a Cade hater, or a Cader, if you will. And going off of last season, like when we first saw them in that Georgia game, I felt extremely justified due to his performance against the Bulldogs. But as the season went along, it turns out Georgia's defense is a lot better than most of the defenses Clemson was going to see as the season went on. And he performed much better, and he looked very good in that playoff game against Texas, even if Clemson came up short and didn't win the game. So I think going into this version of the ACC with Klubnik, having that kind of settled, I look at Clemson and I'm sitting there thinking, if they don't win the ACC this year, it's got to be a disappointing season. They should be the favorite in this league. I understand that Miami has brought in Carson Beck and they have a very talented team as well. But just based on the culture and the roster that they've built and the fact that Dabo's now using the transfer portal and actually helping to supplement that roster, I look at these Tigers and it's like, it's ACC or bust for me. And it can't be, like, to your point, Beanie, they can't backdoor their way in like they did last year. I feel like this is a team that needs to be the dominant force in the ACC and should be the dominant force in the ACC this year.
after the 2011 season, when West Virginia ran the same play for about, 15 touchdowns in a 70-33
Yep.
Orange Bowl win, Dabo Swinney said, we've got to change things. And he went and hired Brent Venables and changed the program's trajectory forever. This was a Clemson defense that its performance and production did not match its talent. And so he said, we've got to make a change. Goes out and hires Tom Allen to come down. And the great poet Dabo Swinney described Tom Allen this spring as, and I quote, a bowling ball of butcher knives. Now, when I think about a defensive coordinator, I would love for him to be described as a bowling ball of butcher knives as he was rolling around that practice field trying to get Clemson to tighten up on the fundamentals, the open field tackling, the small things. Because when we are talking about the difference between backdooring your way into the CFP or showing up to the big dance like you're ready to win something, it is about having the details down pat. So I give credit to Dabo Swinney for a little bit of a pivot on his transfer portal status, but also for the knowledge to know that as great as Wes Goodwin had been for that program, he had been there as a GA, as an assistant, he was Brent Venables' top deputy, being willing to move on. That was a big move for Dabo and a good thing for the Tigers. Clemson, they were the next ACC champion after Florida State. Florida State, yikes, 2-10 last season. Tom, what's your burning question for the Seminoles?
It's a situation where I look at Florida State and I say, there's no way they can be as bad as they were last year. The question is, how much better can they realistically be, even with the changes that they made this offseason? Because Thomas Castellanos, to me, is a good college football quarterback, but he is not the kind of college football quarterback I sit and look at and say, that's a guy who can win a conference. That's a guy who can lead you to the college football playoff. And then you bring in Gus Malzahn, who I have the same exact feeling about as an offensive coordinator. That's an offense that could get you to a bowl. It's not an offense that's going to get you to a conference title or a national title. So I look at the situation, and it's so volatile the way that Mike Norvell has built his Florida State roster that we have seen what happens when they hit on all their transfer portal guys. They win the ACC and go undefeated. But then when they miss, they go 2-10. I have a feeling they're going to land somewhere in between. They're going to be in that 8-win range, but I'm not super confident about them competing for the ACC.
Yeah, Tom, neither am I. I don't know a team in college football that has missed more or missed bigger than Florida State last season. They missed about every position that they went out and got in the portal. And I don't see how right now the moves that they made, getting Thomas Castellanos from BC, getting, the coach that you just mentioned, that they're going to win, the portal wars or win the games on the football field, because those players aren't the guys that I see and say, you know what, they got a fighting chance to go out and win a conference title.
Well, we'll find out when the Florida State Seminoles open the season against the FCS. Oh, no, it's Alabama. Oh, no, they start against Alabama. So no time to be able to ease your way into the schedule. We'll learn a lot about the new look Seminoles right off the bat. Well, coming up on the other side, talk about replacing talent. What's got to happen in Boulder for Colorado to back up what was a very successful year 2 season for the Buffs? We'll get into that and more from the Big 12 next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. That's Beanie Wells. That's Tom Fornelli. I'm Chip Patterson. As we continue to work our way around the country, looking at some of the burning questions and storylines around spring practice, as we turn our attention to the Big 12. Beanie, we got to start at the biggest, shiniest talking point that we have in the conference. It is the team that wasn't just, doing TV ratings. They also got the results in 2024, tied for first place in the conference. Deion Sanders rewarded with a big new contract. Now, what's your burning question around this Buffs program moving forward?
If they have what it takes from a talent perspective to stay relevant. Obviously, we know Deion Sanders and, the eyes and the ears that he commands. So they're going to have the relevancy from that standpoint. But the on-field production, losing Shador, losing Travis Hunter, and then you go down the list of the receiver production that they lose, and Wester and Shepard and Jimmy Horn Jr., can they be a competent football team that when you put them out there on the football field, they're going to be competitive and talked about as one of the biggest and best teams in the Big 12? huge question. I love the fact that they got Caden Salter. I think he's a star in the making, but what is the rest of this football team going to look like?
Yeah, it really is kind of a fascinating situation. Like when Dion first took this job, there were legitimate questions of, well, is he in it for the long haul, or is he in it just, to help Shedeur get to the NFL? And then is he going to peace out? Because he had never coached at any level anywhere without one of his sons being on the team he was coaching. But we clearly got the answer to that this offseason when just a few weeks ago, the Colorado signed him to a very, lucrative 5-year extension to his deal. And now this will be the first time where he won't have his sons. But more importantly, you also don't have Travis Hunter. And we saw that in this roster, like the way that Colorado went about building their roster through the portal in the last few years was designed to put players around Shedeur at quarterback and Travis as a wide receiver, cornerback superstar. You were trying to supplement them. But now that those two are gone, will the way that they have worked in the portal have the same kind of impact? Because you mentioned Caden Salter, who had a very solid year at Liberty 2 years ago, struggled a little bit last year. We know the ability is there for him to play well in an offense suited to his abilities. But did they have that superstar? Did they have that guy that can help them win a game when maybe they're not at their best? Because that's what they had in Hunter. That's what they had in Shedeur Sanders. So going into a Big 12, to which we talk about this all the time on the show, it is a coin flip league. There are a bunch of teams in this league where you look at every single matchup and it's a 3-point spread either side where you don't know who's going to win. There's a lot of there's very little margin for error in the Big 12. So it's one of those situations where if they hit gold in the portal with some of these guys that they brought in and they improve a little bit along the lines of scrimmage, this is a Buffalo team that could once again be competing for a Big 12 championship berth. If they don't, things can go south pretty quick in this league. Look at what happened to teams like Utah last year, where a couple of injuries completely derailed the season to where the team that was expected to win the league before the year was barely in contention by the end of it. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out and what kind of impact it has, because as you mentioned, Beanie, Coach Prime is always going to get you attention. But the kind of attention you're getting will depend on how many games you're winning, and then it could get ugly pretty quick.
Yeah, going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. We are all three of us are sort of on the same generation. Obviously, we were doing different things in college. Beanie's first team all conference, getting ready to be a first-round NFL draft pick. Tom and I are just taking in college football as it is. But the hire of Rich Rodriguez hits all the nostalgia buttons for me. But my question is, like, Beanie, is it just going to be nostalgia, or do you think we'll also see some of the same on-field success that will make us remember why he was such a legend in Morgantown before?
No, I think it's definitely going to be, one of those deals to where we're going to get the nostalgia, but we're also going to see the success. He's back home in an area in which he's comfortable recruiting, and we know the type of system and what type of offense he's going to run. And we just watched him have success at previous places. I think Rich Rod is going to put West Virginia back on the national map. I think the recruits and the players and the fan base is going to rally around that program, and I think they're going to get it done. I'm looking forward to watching him have a lot of success back there in Morgantown.
Yeah, Rich Rodriguez is a good football coach. Like, he might not get West Virginia back to the place they were in 2007 when they were in the national title picture, which then helped him get the Michigan job. But everywhere he has gone, he has won games. Now, maybe at Michigan, he didn't win enough for them to be happy with what he was doing. But you look at that. He went to Arizona. He won games. He goes to Jacksonville State, takes them from the FCS to the FBS level, and they're immediately winning games and competing for the Conference USA title. I think this is a great hire for West Virginia. Not only will it be nostalgia, we will see West Virginia being a good team in the Big 12 who is going to be playing in the upper half of the league if things go right.
Hey, and what's more nostalgic than saying no TikToks, right? I mean, he's just going to say no TikTok dances. I mean, right. You really are taking me back to 2007 with this one. I like that Rich Rod getting things rolling. I agree. What he did at Jacksonville State showed you why he is that kind of coach. All right. Our thanks to Beanie Wells. You can follow him at Beanie Wells 26. You can follow him at Tom Fornelli. You can follow me at Chip Patterson. You can download and listen to the Cover 3 podcast wherever you get your podcasts.